All right, so we're just streaming so people can tune in.
This is more civilized.
Thank you much. Is one more time like that? What's behind? Yes, sir. Seen that song from Book of Mormon. You and me, but most.
Did you see that?
Forever. No, I just have the score.
We're going to go see it.
It's really gross.
We should make that a field trip. Field trip.
Oh, that's nice.
The singing rooster
Nice
not.
job. It's so loud.
I don't think we actually serve seniors anymore, do we?
From time to time, we guys think, hey, Jack, do we have another order going in for Singing Rooster pretty soon?
No, I think nobody's brought it up. Maybe I should open the
That
door.
stuff gets pricey.
It'd be easy to do. I'll introduce the idea on Sunday.
Sure.
Try to get some buyers.
We ready?
Yeah.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to All Saints Cathedral on this fourth Thursday in Lent. Today is also the feast of St. Joseph, who's one of my favorite saints in the calendar, a guy who just sort of did his job and slipped off into oblivion with grace and with style. I'm Kevin Carroll. I'm the Dean of All Saints Cathedral, and joining me this evening are Bishop Miller and Christopher Wells. Christopher Wells is the editor of the Living Church, whose headquarters is on the second floor of All Saints Cathedral, and who have been generously providing us with some high-speed internet for these last few weeks, so thank you for that. Christopher's in his 6th year as an editor of the Living Church and has really transformed that magazine into a publication that is enjoyed by many, many people throughout the world at this point. Please feel free to ask questions this evening. You can join us on Facebook at All Saints Cathedral Milwaukee and on Twitter. And next week, our last week, we'll welcome back Woody Anderson, who is professor of New Testament at Nashotah House, and when we explore the Passion narrative of St. John. But this evening, we're looking at the Passion narrative of St. Luke. So without any further ado, Bishop Miller and Christopher, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everybody, and thank you all here for joining us again this week as we continue our look at the Passion Gospels. Tonight, we are looking at the Lucan telling of that story, and I think it's important for us to note, and I believe you would agree, Christopher, that whenever we think about the Gospel of Luke, we have to remember that it's part one of part two, because in Luke and Acts really function as a unit, and that while there's debate, you might want to talk a little bit about this, that were they written simultaneously or were they written at separate times with the mind of one to another, we certainly have to look at them as a unit.
Yeah, that's right. Together they comprise a huge chunk of the New Testament. I don't have a horse in the race. I mean, I'm not smart enough to know if they were written to be together or not. One scholar I was looking at, Luke Timothy Johnson, he was speaking about foreshadowing in Luke, foreshadowing Acts. And his discussion treats them very much as a unit, as if the author is sort of crafting them together. Brevard Childs, who I looked at, said, Luke was written first. And he sort of was against that kind of a reading. So, but yeah, it's fascinating sort of pair.
Right.
They go together.
Sure, I remember my seminary professor, John Koenig, talking about how that Luke Acts really is the gospel of the Spirit, the work of the Spirit of the Christ in the person of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, and the work of the Spirit of Christ at work in his continuing body, the church. And I think that's another way that we can kind of look at that, certainly from Luke's first speech, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, in the words of Jesus.
Yeah, and his prologue is very interesting. I mean, it's this sort of formal, formulaic kind of, letter to what does he say?
Theophilus.
Theophilus, thank you.
Which means lover of God.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it was Johnson who said, so this is a gospel written by someone we don't know to someone we don't know. And the tradition, holds that Luke was maybe accompanied St. Paul, but for whatever reason, Luke felt the need for another gospel, and he refers to, many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events. So he seems to be kind of alluding to other gospels, and he feels a need for another one. And Brevard Child said, he maybe thought that his gospel was better or an improvement, but the tradition said, thank you very much, we accept your gospel, and we'll make it the third gospel, and we'll publish the others as well.
Yeah.
So it sort of sits right there with them.
That's true, yeah, very good. And that leads to, I think, another point we want to make when we think about Luke Acts and we think about this passion narrative, is that Luke is very much a student of history and wants to record and think about the historical implications. And we certainly remember that when we think of the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, or at least the passion narrative, the nativity narrative, where a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. That Luke is setting it in this time and place, which everybody knew. And then the great first event of the first proclamation in Acts in chapter 2, which in the first chapter retells the story of Jesus' ascension. Then we have this set in the day of Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were together in one place. And I think that's another.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
He's interested in the church. I guess there's a school of interpretation that wants to make Luke sort of a Catholic or like a churchman, and I think Child said he thought that was sort of too much. But clearly he's interested in not only the past and this sort of fulfillment of Jewish promises and expectations for the Messiah, but then he's interested in subsequent history.
Sure. Yeah.
And he's locked in a battle with Jewish authorities. He's interested in the person of Jesus in the midst of conflicts in Israel. I read someone saying so there's all this sort of debate between Jesus and the religious leaders about the Old Testament scriptures, and so this is the sort of beginning of the church here, as we know, in a Jewish context, and it's Jews debating with one another, and it under sort of with the Roman boot on their neck. So there's some political anxiety and pressure running through this gospel as well.
That's certainly true. And then that leads us in many ways both into the first act of the gospel of the passion narrative, but also into something that we want to reflect on, the fact that Luke is the gospel where there's a lot of healings.
Yeah.
And no wonder that the order of healing ministry in our Episcopal Church and in the worldwide community is the Order of St. Luke.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. So many hospitals are dedicated to St. Luke. The former St. Luke's in Racine, St. Luke's in Kansas City. Was it St. Luke's in the Diocese in Houston, Texas too? I'm not
That's
sure.
a good question.
So,
I'm not sure. Yeah.
So
That's a great point.
Something to think about.
And I'll throw in one thing there too that I wanted to say, which is we have a sort of like dignified Jesus in some ways in Luke, and I think it'll unfold as we get into some of this. But Johnson talks about Jesus as the sort of sage or the wise man, the sophos.
Right.
And he's attained the sort of wisdom of the philosopher. So he says that the cross is scandalous still in Luke, but that there's sort of like these Greek moral ideas running through it. So Jesus is like interested in self-control. He models self-control. He's got sort of freedom from fear. He's more courageous. And he's also a sort of man of justice. And I think some of the sort of, some of the way he makes the disciples look good, and the way he approaches the passion itself reflects some of that. And I think that permits Luke sort of artistically to do some of that healing stuff as well. Because it's sort of, it's less of a sort of panicked, stressed out Jesus and more of a sort of follow me teaching Jesus, and with a view to the whole world.
Well, yeah, and that doesn't, as you were saying that brought into mind, because according to tradition, Luke's version has its apostolicity comes from the Apostle Paul.
Right.
And as you shared about that, the wisdom, the sophos, I began to think of Paul saying, "Where is the wise man? Where is the debater of this age? Has not the cross made foolish the wisdom of the wise?" And
That's a great point.
So yeah,
That's right. And this is a peculiar cruciform wisdom, to be sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's move into the Passion itself, and as you know, we begin with the scene of the agony in the garden and
Bishop,
Jesus praying.
Do you want to remind the people watching of kind of like your 4-section structure that we're going to go into?
Sure, that'd be great. Remember that in each of our Gospels, we're based on the work of Raymond Brown and his marvelous work, A Crucified Christ in Holy Week, which is still available on Amazon if you want copies, and I commend to you. There is a fourfold structure of the Passion narratives: the agony, the time on the Mount of Olives, the trial before Jewish authorities, the trial before Pilate, and then the crucifixion itself and burial. So thank you for that, Kevin. And so let's begin in Act 1 with Jesus praying on the Mount of Olives. And as you said, Christopher, this really is a Jesus more in control. His words here are interesting. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew from them a stone's throw beyond them, not far away, but he was nearby, and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, but yet not my will, but yours be done." And an angel appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So that Jesus there is really having that conversation with the Father. It's very much that.
Yeah.
And that begins, that we'll hear him address his Father a number of times as we go through the different acts of this gospel.
Yeah, that's right. And only in Luke does an angel come to give Jesus strength there.
Right, yes.
And he's also sweating drops of blood in Luke. And you might think, well, that sounds kind of stressed out. But I think it's Luke Johnson who says, this is sort of Jesus, the athlete. And he's sort of stressed, but finally ready for the fight and rising to the challenge.
Yes, and Brown points out that the language and the way it's all described is very much that way, like an athletic contest.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and Luke uses the word agonia, and so that's where we get the agony in the garden. But in English, we might sort of think agony, but that can mean a number of things. Johnson says it means the supreme tension of the athlete covered with sweat at the start of the contest, and he rises from his prayer ready to enter the trial. So it's sort of the agon, which is like the fight that he's going into.
Right, exactly. Like just when you're ready to take off for a race,
right,
or before the game begins.
And he goes back to the disciples to comfort them because they're distraught in Luke. In the next verse there, he finds them sleeping because of grief, their grief. In Matthew and Mark, he's the one who's grieved. But now he comes back to comfort the disciples.
Right, indeed. And then, of course, we have the arrest of Jesus, the second part of this first act. And what makes what makes this interesting particularly is they asked Jesus if they should strike with the swords. There's no answer of Jesus recorded. But then one of them strikes the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear, and Jesus says no more of this. And then in this gospel note, he touches the man's ear and heals them.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a healing right in the midst of that.
Yeah, that's right. And this is, several commentators say this sort of anticipates the theme of Jesus's love and forgiveness, even love of his enemies, which comes up later as well. But so here he is healing his opponent, even in the midst of his own peril. So he's being betrayed, and he sort of heals the person who's. It's interesting.
Right. Yes, indeed. And then, of course, there Jesus addresses the chief priest of the temple guard, and that saying is not unlike what is in some of, I believe Matthew has that as well, as does John. But it's interesting, the line there, "This is your hour." Which I believe.
Yeah, what verse is that?
That's verse 22:53.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, this is your hour and the power of darkness. Yeah, it's sort of a cosmic historical statement of Jesus there. Yeah, sort of, I think, maybe gesturing at the judgment.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So then we enter into the Peter disowning Jesus, and it's interesting that in Luke's gospel, as opposed to Matthew and Mark, Jesus's denial happens before the trial, not in the midst of the trial. In other words, in Luke's gospel, they take Jesus to the high priest's house, but there's no legal proceeding during that evening. They wait until the next morning for the legal proceeding to begin. So it's while they're in the courtyard together that Peter denies Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
Brown describes Jesus as being right nearby.
Right.
This isn't
Right.
while your master's away, you're denying him, but right while you're in the same room with him,
Yes.
you're saying, I don't know this guy.
Yeah, yeah, it's extraordinary. I think it sort of elevates the drama of the moment. And some commentators say that Matthew and Mark are a little more dramatic than Luke, but to me, it's pretty dramatic when you betray your Lord. And then you've got that verse 61 there. The Lord turned and looked at Peter.
Yes.
And so apparently Jesus has been watching the whole time he was denying him. And that's just, that's sort of wrenching.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
It really is. Brown also makes the note that this time in the garden, in the high priest's courtyard, is also the scene of Jesus being abused as a prophet, which confirms his foreknowledge that he would die as a prophet, that mourn over Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I would have gathered on my wings prophets, only cannot die outside of Jerusalem, etc.
Interesting,
So
right.
prophetic fulfillment.
Yeah, that's right, the
as
importance of Jerusalem, right.
So then we come to the next morning, and on the next morning is when, and it's interesting that the trial of Jesus begins at daybreak, which is when a trial would have normally begun in Jewish religion, which, we talked about how sometimes in Matthew and Mark, the Jews are portrayed as rushing this whole thing and laying all the blame on them, and see, they even did it backhandedly. But Luke is saying, no, this is part of the normal course of all of this thing, that there was something going on that was a little bit more normative. And then we have, of course, the question, the chief priests and teachers of the law meet together, and Jesus was led before them. If you are the Christ, they said, tell us. And he answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on high, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the mighty God. And so the thing of, even if I told you, you would not believe, is the Lucan kind of twist on what Mark has said there.
Yeah, there was Jesus seems a little evasive when he's questioned.
Right.
And I think it's Johnson said, you know, he doesn't have a martyr complex. He's not sort of on a mission to die.
Right.
And also the fact that he's going through this legal procedure, it anticipates, it sort of, I don't know if it foreshadows, but it certainly precedes the number of similar sort of trials that Paul undergoes in Acts.
Precisely, and I think, yeah, that's very
So
much
there is kind of an interest in
how
the
these
justice
trials work.
system.
Right, yes. And we move into that as we move into Act 3 with the time before Pilate.
That's right.
And I think Brown and both Lee Timothy Johnson would say that would want us to pay attention to the similarities of this trial and the trial of Paul before King Agrippa.
Yeah, that's right.
And the speech that is made there by Paul talking about what God has done in the person of Jesus Christ.
That's interesting, right?
Yeah.
That's right. Standing before the powers.
And so we have Jesus here before Pilate, and of course they came bringing false charges against him. We found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of our taxes to Caesar and claims to be Christ the King. And of course, just before this, before the entry into Jerusalem, Jesus has already said, "I'll render these things to Caesar that are Caesar's,
That's
and to God's
exactly
the things
right.
that are God's." So, and the exact opposite has happened.
Right.
He said, "You can pay taxes. That's fine, no problem."
That's right.
And yet, I think there was a part of the Jewish community that was unwilling to pay taxes because it meant they had to buy Roman coin, and Roman coin was seen as profane because it had an image on it, a violation of the commandment of not having any graven image.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm mindful of a couple weeks ago when Woody Anderson was here and you were talking about sort of to what extent is Jesus' mission and message revolutionary. And Woody said that, you know, Luke kind of gets back into this a little bit. I think it's interesting. Luke goes to great pains here in beginning in chapter 23 to emphasize that Jesus is not perverting the nation. According to Pilate and Herod. But Barabbas was an insurrectionist.
Exactly.
So it seems like Luke is making sort of a real important political point to himself there. And interestingly, on the healing thing, I think it might have been Ray Brown said that Jesus even heals here,
Right.
Because he heals the friendship with Herod and Pilate. He sort of oversees their reconciliations, or key occasions.
That's right. Yeah, that wonderful line where he says, Herod sent him back to Pilate the day Herod and Pilate become friends. Before this, they had been enemies.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I found that interesting. Brown's comment there too, and of course it's only in Luke's gospel that Jesus is sent to Herod. That occurs, and
That's right.
And Brown and some others make the point that, well, Herods are always messing stuff up in Luke's gospel. There's the Herod during the time of Jesus's birth. There's this Herod there's the Herod who killed John the Baptist. There's this Herod who probably was a different one who kills Jesus. And then there's Paul before Herod Agrippa.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this might even be sort of a composite of them all, kind of a literary Herod.
Right, yeah.
But interestingly enough, he finds Jesus, as is the theme in Luke, to be innocent and just, righteous.
It's interesting. I'm reminded here of a story supposedly attributed to Pilate that Herod wasn't very observant as a Jew. And so he said, I'd rather be Herod's pig than his son, because the Herods had killed some of their children. And it's a play on the Greek words "weis" for pig and "weos" for son. So interesting. And an interesting note that you reminded me of from my Greek study days.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. So we have then the reconciliation of Herod and Pilate, but even that healing ministry doesn't help Jesus escape the cross. Pilate gives the demand of the crowd to crucify Jesus and to release for him Barabbas, one thrown into prison for insurrection and murder.
Yeah, that's right. And this will give me a chance to say something important point in Luke. In the other Gospels, there's all kinds of examples of this, but in general, it's the crowds, it's everybody kind of going after Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And again, going back to that antagonism or the intra-Jewish debate that Luke is focused on, he's real clear throughout this Gospel that it's the chief priests, the rulers, who have it in for Jesus. There is one instance where he says, and the people. But in general, it's the religious authorities.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sort of opens a place for Jesus, or for Luke, to kind of be interested in the voices of some of the people that Jesus runs into,
Mm-hmm.
like as he starts to carry the cross and runs into the women of Jerusalem. I don't know if we want to go there.
Well, let's go there, because that's where we are. Jesus has now been condemned to death. Again, Simon of Cyrene is asked to carry Jesus's cross, the cross piece that would have been used on a stand that was probably already, the vertical stand was already in place at that time. And as Jesus is walking to the place of crucifixion, a large number of people followed him, including women and others who mourned and wailed for him. And Jesus says to them, "Don't you, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. The time will come when you will say, blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and the hills cover us. For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" And I know you want to allude, as we, in our preparation, of what happened about this station of the cross.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
ninth station of the cross.
Yeah. Well, Brown asks sort of like, why is this in Luke? Why does he insert this? And he thinks it's probably, that Luke was constrained, as he says, to get into this because of the recent factual destruction of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also an amazing opportunity, moment where Jesus reaches out. Again, he's carrying his own cross, going to his own crucifixion, and he stops to comfort these women in their affliction and, coming persecutions and difficulties. And so it becomes this sort of, I think, beautiful moment where Jesus reads the history of the church through his own suffering. We see a kind of, the difficulty of the church, the pain of Israel and Jerusalem's suffering. And the eighth station in this version published by the Church Publishing.
This one authorized in the Book of Occasional Services.
Yeah, is it?
Yes.
I love these stations, and they're really beautiful. And the versicle response, those who sowed with tears will reap with songs of joy. So it's already placing the women of Jerusalem's suffering in a larger context.
Mm-hmm.
And then the prayer, teach your church, O Lord, to mourn the sins of which it is guilty and to repent and forsake them, that by your pardoning grace, the result of our iniquities may not be visited upon our children and our children's children. Very profound.
Yes.
And I remember starting to pray this in graduate school and thinking, wow, here we are following Jesus's walk up to his crucifixion, and all of a sudden we're praying for the church and her sins. I think that's pretty bold.
Yeah.
And kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, and profound, yeah.
Indeed.
So we all participate in the women of Jerusalem's anguish.
Indeed, that's always such a powerful verse when it's read in the Passion narrative in the years that we read Luke, which it will be next year.
Yeah.
So Luke also mentions the two other men who are crucified with Jesus, both criminals, and they come to the place in the skull. And again, here Jesus, the one in communion with his Father, the athlete girded for battle, says, "Father, forgive them; they don't know what they are doing."
That's right.
And this is a unique, that we're now coming on 3 words of Jesus from the cross that are unique to Luke's gospel.
Yes,
The
that's
first
right.
is that, Father, forgive them, they do not know what they are doing. Brown commented that he saw these words addressed particularly to the Roman soldiers who were simply pawns of the state, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That while we certainly should and must hear those words as speaking to us as well, that perhaps there was a particular reference, because we've just told the daughters of Jerusalem
Right.
not to weep.
Right.
He's now speaking to to the they is now somebody new. They're the ones nailing him to the cross.
Yeah, I think it might have been Brown too, who says even here we have a hint that the Jewish authorities, who are really unjust throughout this whole thing because they're pursuing the just Jesus, even the chief priests and Pharisees may have acted out of ignorance.
Yes.
Because Jesus says, "For they know not what they do." And so again, this is sort of mercy. This is grace. This is modeling the forgiving of your enemies.
Right.
Brown says it runs against the general New Testament judgment of deliberate blindness and malevolence on the part of the Jewish authorities. And of course, this prayer is repeated again, another connection between Luke and Acts.
Yes, right. I was just turning to that in the 6th chapter of
chapter 7
of Acts. Yes.
Stephen,
Stephen, the first martyr.
Yeah.
Lord, and he cries aloud, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them."
Yeah. So this is pretty extraordinary. Again, this is Paul would like this maybe the wisdom that's foolishness to the Gentiles.
Yeah, indeed. So Jesus speaks his first word for the cross. Father, forgive them. Again, his lots are divided. People are sneering at him. He saved others, let him save himself. That's also found in the Matthew's telling of the story. And the soldiers mock him and offer him wine mixed with vinegar. And the sign is placed above him, the King of the Jews. And then we come again to that other marvelous Lucan scene of the two thieves, one on the right and one on the left, and the first one is mocking Jesus, and the other criminal says we are punished justly, we are getting what our deeds deserve. This man has done nothing wrong. And then he says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus answered him, "I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
Yeah.
We mentioned this passage in our very first session, that this is Brown likes to think of this as the good thief who stole the cross, who stole the kingdom,
That's right.
who stole heaven. Right, yeah.
Couple of interesting things on that. I wanted to get more into Thomas Aquinas's gathering of patristic authorities on Luke, but I didn't have time. But I did notice that he cites Ambrose on this, who's sort of thinking historically about the other Gospels. He said, doesn't this kind of contradict the other Gospels, which say that both thieves derided him? And he goes, well, maybe they both derided him, and then one of them did this other stuff.
Yeah.
So he sort of tries to synthesize it, which is interesting. But yeah, if I could share with you, there's another great thing. Aquinas gets into this text in his commentary on the Apostles' Creed, which is a fantastic read and really, really fun. And he says basically that the teaching is sort of, this is the beginning of the sacramental power. So that's how Jesus can save him, because all the sacraments get their power through the passion of Jesus. So he says, having opened the side of Christ on the cross, the door of paradise was opened. Having poured out his blood, the stain of sin is removed. God is pleased. The weakness of sin is taken away. The punishment due to sin is lifted. He says, for that reason, Jesus can say, today you'll be with me in paradise. He says, this was not said previously. This was not said to Adam, nor to Abraham, nor to David. Yet today, when the door of the kingdom of God is open, when the Son of God is dying on the earth, he, Jesus, offers pardon to the thief. And then he quotes Hebrews 10, we have confidence through the blood of Christ. So it's a wonderful kind of pre-modern way of reading the Bible there, but it's rich, theologically rich.
Right, yes, and certainly as you read that and then pointed us to Hebrews, I was thinking of that passage in Hebrews, which is that meditation on Psalm 95. Today, if you would hearken to his voice, he has given us a day today.
Yeah, interesting, that's right.
And if we take the theory that Paul is either a letter, the Hebrews is either written by Paul, or as Verna Dozier used to intimate, she believed it was written by his close workers, probably by Priscilla, because they wouldn't record a woman as writing a letter in that time. Certainly they would have been aware of Paul's thinking about all of that, and so a similar influence to the one who influenced Luke.
Well, and you think of today as the day,
Yeah.
Good Friday.
Right, yeah.
This is the pivot of history. You know, this is why we can call it Good Friday. I mean, it's a day like no other day. The day that God died, and opens the power of, you know, his passion to the gift of grace. It's beautiful.
It is, and certainly I think Luke paints the passion just like the revivalist preacher would in that old revivalist sermon that Tony Campolo used to like to quote. It's Friday. Sunday's coming. It's Friday. Sunday's coming.
That's right.
Yeah, so I think there's very much of that.
There's a great, actually, and this notion that Augustine, well, I won't get into that. The notion that sort of the resurrection and the grace of God is available immediately through the passion.
Right.
So the resurrection is already anticipated. Kind of like in Philippians 2, when at the incarnation, the passion is anticipated.
Right, yes. Because we always have to remember it's one Christ event.
That's right.
It's one Christ event. And Thomas Julian Talley, one of the great scholars on the liturgical year, had a theory that the reason we celebrate the Annunciation and Good Friday and Easter kind of all around the same time was that the framers of the first liturgical year were trying to show the connection between those three things.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because we've all had years when the Feast of the Annunciation is moved until after Easter week because it occurs within Holy Week or Easter week.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, fascinating. And then, of course, and so after that, Jesus says to him, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." He's asked of Jesus those words. Then we have Jesus's last words from the cross. And again here, there's no, not my God, why have you forsaken me? The word from the cross is, again, addressed to the Father. Father, into your hands.
That's right.
I commend my spirit.
That's right.
And
It's very different. Yeah, in the Mark and Matthew, it's the cry of abandonment.
Yes, right.
And Brown says in John, it's triumph. But here it's trust. So
Right.
again, you have almost this sort of Greek kind of wise person who's modeling self-control.
Right.
But I mean, which isn't to say that it's not, he hasn't been vulnerable. I mean, obviously he's dying, but he trusts God.
Yes, I think one could almost paint the difference between Luke's telling and John's telling of where it's really a victorious statement.
Yeah.
Luke is I commit my spirit, it's confidence.
Yeah.
And John is spiking the ball.
That's right.
I mean, for lack of a
Sure.
and to use that to continue on the athletic image,
Which St. Paul would love.
and which
Running the
right,
race with
right.
endurance.
Indeed.
And one other thing too, just briefly about the curtain torn in two. I thought that was interesting. Brown noted that in Luke it precedes Jesus' death
Yes.
because it's kind of a dramatic, dark thing. He says that because he says after it, only acts of grace will follow.
Right. Yeah.
And so again, it's sort of the healing of Jesus. All these wonderful things happen. The centurion declares Jesus' innocence. The crowd is moved to repentance. I'm sort of anticipating a little bit. Joseph of Arimathea really, really appears as a good guy in Luke. The women prepare for his burial. That only happens in Luke. And Brown has this wonderful kind of liturgical thing, which is the women of Jerusalem on the way of the cross were mourning his death, which is ritually appropriate. And then after he dies, there are women ready to prepare him for his burial.
Yes, and even those who
But that's only in Luke.
are also beating their breasts, so there's the beginning of repentance right there.
Yes, that's right.
And isn't it interesting, again, to go back to our Acts 7 comparison, Stephen, as they stoned him, calls out, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So again,
Another tie
I
between,
commend my spirit.
yeah. And Jesus, because he's this wise teacher, Stephen is a good student of Jesus,
Right, yes.
repeating his very words and imitating his example.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true indeed. Well, let's finish up this then, because you've named all the good things that happened afterwards, and I think that's wonderful.
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
think
I
that's
didn't mean
how
that.
Luke would want us to actually be.
Yeah, yeah.
After the curtain is torn before the death, and so close together that maybe at the moment of death, but after, then only good things happen.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And the notion that the crowds are sort of potentially being converted. 23 verse 48. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their breasts. That's extraordinary. I mean, that's an invitation to us.
Right.
Surely. I mean, I'm thinking again of the conversations we've had in the preceding weeks. And, crucify him, the extent to which we can see ourselves in that.
Right.
So we're guilty.
Yes.
And here they are going home beating their breasts. It's sort of the beginning of penitence, the beginning of the conversion. I think Johnson says, with this sign of distress and remorse, Luke suggests a preparation for the repentance of the people in Acts. They will become part of the restored people of God.
Right.
It's sort of, maybe that's like the purpose of Lent actually for us.
Right, yes.
I think of us as sort of humble Episcopalians, 2,000 years later here gathered at All Saints Cathedral reading this and maybe being touched in any way.
Yes. And certainly the one other piece we want to note is that in Luke, the statement of a centurion watching is not a confession of Jesus' divinity, but a proclamation of his innocence. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. He says, truly this man was innocent, or who was it? One of the scholars said, Johnson said, it really should be righteous. It's innocent, but it's more than that. He says, Jesus is the righteous one, who throughout Luke is shown to be totally devoted to God. But whereas in Matthew and Mark, he says, this is God's son.
Right, exactly.
Which is powerful in its own way. Here he's saying he was righteous or innocent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Something that struck me in listening to this conversation is harkening back to my days of classical studies and thinking about a Greek tragedy and how Greek tragedy unfolds. And I think scholars sort of agree that probably the writer of Luke was more intellectual, his Greek was more refined, so he was coming up in that tradition, and the whole notion in a Greek tragedy of the protagonist, Jesus, the protagonist, taking on all the antagonists in the world and coming out heroically and with virtue, and even the last words where he said that this was a righteous man. And also in a Greek tragedy, how very often it was the chorus or the crowd that was affected throughout the course of the play.
Yeah, right.
And very often the chorus was redeemed, or their thinking or thought process was redeemed as the play unfolded. And it kind of strikes me that of the three that we've looked at, this really is sort of in the genre of a Greek tragedy.
I think that's very true, Kevin. And certainly as I think about the years where in parishes where they read the gospel and assign parts to people, in Luke's gospel, there's a lot more parts to pass out. Right.
Yeah, it's not hard to picture this being dramatized, is it?
No, it's not at all.
One of the, again, I mean, he's following Mark and making a bunch of adjustments. Luke is known for his literary elegance.
Right.
He tells like a very clear story. It's got a beginning, middle, and an end. And you just think about a number of the unique things about in Luke that we discussed. As I was reading them again, I was picturing them in any number of filmic
Right, yes.
enactments of
Sure.
the gospel, and you think, well, they just lend themselves to that. Like, how many times haven't you seen Jesus sort of look at Peter after the third?
Right, precisely. Yes.
It's dramatic. I mean, you want to kind of get your camera out and start filming
There's that
action.
cinematic attempt. And certainly any story of Jesus' birth that we've seen on film is going to begin with the Lucan Annunciation,
Right.
and the,
Yes.
and if they include an appearance to Joseph, whose day is today, as we mentioned.
Yeah. Or again, the Stations of the Cross. I mean, that's actually how we dramatize, enact Christ's Passion at most parishes in the Catholic tradition. We literally walk around to the stations and enact it, and behold, women of Jerusalem.
Sure, and that's something that happened in Christendom very, very early. We have the pilgrimages of Egeria, and is that the 3rd or 4th century? I can't remember, but very early, where an Egyptian nun goes to the Holy Land to see their observances and records them. So that's how we know what these liturgies look like.
And specifically the Easter Vigil.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Or every Sunday. I mean, really, that's what we do every Sunday. Maybe in a lesser way than what we do during Holy Week, but we remember that whole passion as it unfolded and the glorious end to it.
That's right.
We live into it in a very real and corporal way.
Yep.
That's right. That's right.
And culminating in the Eucharist.
Right.
Yeah.
As the sort of the sacrament of sacraments, which typifies the Passion.
Right.
So we're always remembering Christ's Passion. And if we're in a beautiful church like our church, which has a painted depiction of the Passion with a corpus, that's all the more dramatic.
Well, Christopher, thanks for being here. We have time for a few questions. And we have Patricia, and we have, I'm getting old.
Jack.
I'm sorry, Jack.
We'll start with Pat.
Well, just a minor point, I guess, but when you mentioned the veil of the temple being torn, I always had an image in my mind of Jesus died, the storm came up dramatically, and the curtain of the temple. They're saying it wasn't in that order.
Well, at least in Luke's gospel, it either happens just before the death or at the time of the death. So that but Luke is recording it before he records Jesus' last words. And because he, at least according to some commentators, went to point to the fact that after Jesus' death, nothing bad happens. And so the rending of the temple and all that.
Just for fun.
Yeah.
Huh.
So at least that's the point that some scholars think he was trying.
I mean, it's still pretty dramatic, like I was saying. It's Luke 23:45. While the light sun failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said. So it's pretty powerful. But it is in a different narrative
order.
place, yeah.
Yeah. Right. Jack.
While I've been preparing for these each week, I remember your admonition, Bishop, that we should look for differences, and one possibly minor, but I hadn't ever noticed it before. This is 23, verse 26, where this seems to indicate that the soldiers commandeered Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross. And I guess I've always had the notion that this nice guy just came along as he was traveling and decided to be a good Samaritan and pick up and carry Jesus' cross. So I wonder if it is only in this book, this particular version.
Matthew and Mark both have compelled a passerby to carry his cross. But Luke, I guess, adds a little color to it, maybe. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, and made him carry it. So it's sort of maybe like adding a little color.
Certainly taking that cinematic description that Christopher talked about, it's easier to view in your mind's eye someone being seized rather than somebody being compelled. Did they argue about it for a long time? No, so yeah.
It is interesting to compare them, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's what makes for fun Bible study too. All right. Other questions? We get anything from Facebook?
No, I'm just thinking it's kind of quiet.
I'm waiting for it to blow up on Facebook. Then
There you
we'll know
go.
we've really arrived.
That's right. Okay. So if we blow up on Facebook, we're good.
Or on Twitter.
Right.
We'll take Twitter.
Oh, Cynthia.
just for reference, the King James does say, now when the centurion saw what was done, he glorified God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. But then when we get to where the temple, the curtain was rent, it says the sun was darkened, which to me sounds more like a type of eclipse versus simply the sun failed. It sounds like more dramatic writing. And then when Jesus gives up his spirit, it says he gave up the ghost, which kind of alludes to a type of a death that we can, it seems mysterious, ordinary and yet mysterious. He gave up the ghost, gave up the spirit. That's all.
Yeah, some of that is based, I think that's interesting, Cindy, and some of that may simply be the English that the translators of the King James Bible were used to using to describe things. The other is that I think it's important to note that after the King James version was translated, they then, not in the not too distant future, discovered some better and earlier manuscripts, and so the translation and the textual works that they were using for translations after King James were much better texts, and there was more to work from that then rendered some of the readings in King James to be somewhat inaccurate.
Well, also, I think ultimately the King James Bible was meant to be heard by people too.
Yes.
It wasn't meant to be read, but that was the final test of the whole project, was to take it out and read it in the kingdom and make sure that it was understood by people.
Right, and so certainly in that time, the expression for dying may have been to give up the ghost, and so.
Well, we used to call the Holy Spirit the Holy Ghost.
The Holy Ghost,
More
right?
common.
Yes. Right. Yes.
But I would point out, isn't the word spirit wonderful?
Yes.
Because it reminds us that we have a soul. I mean, it reminds us of kind of old-fashioned Christian anthropology, body and soul. And this notion we have an immortal soul, a spirit, which would be like, the seat of the image of God. So it's a sort of rich tradition. And I can't help thinking, of our liturgy, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, and with thy spirit.
That's right, yes.
And with thy spirit, Father,
That's right.
But of course, we've lost that when we say, and also with you. Although our Roman Catholic friends have now say, and with thy spirit. But there's something wonderful about spirit, because it reminds you of this Christological moment.
Right, and we always live in a tension about that too, though, because we don't want to so emphasize spirit that we forget that Christianity is an incarnation religion, and we end up, as one person was described as being so heavenly minded that they were no earthly good. And
that's right. But this precisely drops you into the body-spirit dynamic.
Right. Yes.
I commend my spirit. Having said that, he breathed his last with his body.
Right. Indeed.
Well, it brings us right back to the very creation, where the Spirit of God hovered over the world, and when we no longer have that in us, we are stone cold dead.
That's right.
I think that's what part of the story helps us realize, is he wasn't just asleep or gone for a few days. He was dead as a doornail.
Yeah.
And so the resurrection wasn't just a resuscitation.
As Charles Dickens says in The Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's a doornail.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, any other questions?
Isn't that the Greek word pneuma?
Pneumos.
Pneuma, yes, it is.
Pneuma, yeah.
Well, thank you for being with us tonight. As you can tell, I have a cold, and so I drank my tea this evening out of a singing rooster cup, which is our Diocese of Milwaukee coffee. You can order it at your local parish. The money goes to help our sisters and brothers in Jeanette, Haiti, and we want to encourage you to support that ministry of microeconomic development. And if you need to learn more about Singing Rooster, you can go on the Diocese webpage and talk and read about the Haiti project and Singing Rooster Coffee. So, Mr. Dean, thank you again for hosting us. Christopher, thank you for being
brother.
with me and having us.
Yep, Larry, swing that camera on so people can see. Thank you again for joining in. We've had over 300 people who've joined in to these talks over the last couple of weeks through the website. You can link on to All Saints Cathedral. Of course, if you're watching that, you already know that. But tell your friends to click on All Saints website or the Diocesan website, and it will give you a link straight through to the past 4 weeks.
Post it on Facebook and then share it.
Yeah, sure. And we ask you to join us again next week at 7:00 when we will look next Thursday when we'll look at Passion Narrative from John's Gospel, and welcome back Woody Anderson, Professor of New Testament from Nashotah House. So until then, good night. God bless.
I don't know if I ever turned on my microphone.